Barry Goldwater to Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan to the first George Bush to Mitt Romney, we've gone through quite a transition over the many decades with regard to what we call in America the conservative movement. And then came Donald Trump. What is the conservative movement now post-Donald Trump, and where's it headed? Let's talk to a guy who knows a little something about the conservative movement because he runs the Heritage Foundation, the leading conservative think tank in D.C., Dr. Kevin Roberts. Dr. Roberts, always good to talk with you.
Thanks for having me.
Do you like think tank, by the way?
Hate it. Because you know why?
Why?
Sorry, that was a really quick
response.
Because
it
shows you how much I despise that term.
It's used as a pejorative sometimes.
Well, it is, but also think tanks deserve that pejorative because too many think tanks in this country and the world publish a white paper and then just let it collect dust.
Yeah.
And what I love about Heritage is that our purpose is to do the research so that we can effect policy change. And the more we can put lead on the target, coming from this bird hunter, the better we are.
So the conservative movement in America today. First, before we talk about how it's different or how it's changed or evolved, or maybe it hasn't, you tell me, what are the founding principles of the conservative movement? Or maybe not founding, but the bedrock principles that won't change ever?
Well, the most important is that we are wired, if we're people of faith, we would say we're wired on our soul. People who aren't of faith would say wired by nature toward self-governance. And in the American context, where the conservative movement has been the healthiest, I would say, in the West, we also believe that the way to achieve that is to have the smallest government possible. It's very important that I kind of hang on that point, though, and say, at Heritage, we're conservatives, not libertarians. So we see a proper role for government in some cases. But then the other part of this is, and this is the Edmund Burke conservative coming out. You know Heritage well enough to know that we're Burkeans or even Kirkians, to reference Russell Kirk. And the reason I mention both of them is that there's something far more important than government, and it is civil society, starting with our families, starting with our neighborhoods, starting with our communities. These are all upstream from politics and policy. And as I'm sure we'll talk about here momentarily, Larry, the conservative movement is re-emphasizing those things because we have such problems in other arenas, especially politics and policy.
So you're mentioning major voices that inspired our founders, as well as our founders themselves, as sort of the basic original voices, the originalists of where we are as a conservative movement. Is that partly why the left, liberals and Democrats, are trying to tear them down, literally tear them down in the public square, but also malign them in history books?
Completely, and that's sad on the one hand, and then on the other hand, thinking about the movement itself, to my knowledge, Heritage is the only policy organization that has stood up to the reprogramming that's gone on at James Madison's Montpelier, at Jefferson's Monticello. Those are just two examples well known of what's going on.
When I took a tour of Monticello, I was mortified by the docent, the person conducting the tour guide on behalf of Monticello, buying into this idea that Thomas Jefferson was a rapist. I think it was part of the demonstration there. And listen, I don't run Monticello. It's up to them to do what they want to do. But that undermines who we are by buying into these things.
Well, it does, and I'm a historian. I happen to be a historian who has taught a lot about the slave trade and slavery, and so I don't want to be engaged in what the left would call whitewashing of history. But to use the Monticello example or the Montpelier example, we ought to go there and sure, hear about the lives of enslaved people. It's a really important understanding. But they're doing that now at the expense of talking about the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
Or in Madison's case, the main author of the Constitution, all, as you pointed out a moment ago, for the purposes of undermining our belief in this country.
Yeah, we're told that context is so important, and yet in those cases there's no context. By the way, while we're at it, if anyone's visiting D.C., Mount Vernon does it right. Mount Vernon is brilliant at addressing all of those issues properly and in context.
They do, and as much scorn as we gave Montpelier and Monticello, and they deserved it all, we celebrated Mount Vernon because it's hard right now if you're running a historic house museum where there were slaves to tell that story in a balanced way. But that's what America is about, and I think it's really important for people to lean into, visit those places that are doing it well.
This is what I love about you, talking with you, because we can go down any path and it's good. But let's get back to where we are as conservatives.
I keep trying to get you off track.
No. Yeah, President Trump wins the nomination. A lot of conservatives are like, well, he's not really a conservative, and he's certainly not, sort of a philosophical conservative necessarily, or at least he doesn't express himself that way, but he's certainly governed as a conservative for the most part. So now post-Trump presidency, and maybe pre-second Trump presidency, What's different about this conservative movement now? Coming from those bedrock principles?
Well, people will sometimes misdiagnose the conservative movement today and say that it's fragmented because of Donald Trump. And that tends to come from never-Trumpers. The point is that Trump recognized the conservative movement had become feckless, frankly, ineffective. If it had any effect, it was from the neoconservatives who wanted to fight every war and nation build. We learned the lessons that those are really bad ideas. Or they were in another camp, which was that everything surrounds the free market. Now, I love the free market, but you and I both know that that flows out of a healthy society, healthy families, and it's something that we should aspire to. As we look forward, regardless of who the next conservative president is, there will be a conservative president in 2025, whoever he or she is. The movement by that point, because I deal with this every day, is going to be a lot more cohesive around the idea that when conservatives are in power, they darn well better wield the power they have, which means that if it's big tech that's being abusive toward people, you use the government to fix that. If in fact government is contributing to, through the marriage penalty, a really bad tax system, the demise of the American family, then let's fix that. And I think it's one of the things that distinguishes conservatives from libertarians. But I should mention a final point, and that is foreign policy. The conservative foreign policy consensus for centuries in this country, coming from George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, was that America be powerful and be able to fight a war, but to only be engaged in foreign policy and certainly warfare if we ask the most important question first: is this in Americans' best interest? What Heritage is doing, we're taking a lot of flack from some neocons about this, is reminding people that's what conservatism is. And I'll just sum up here, Larry, and say that I think, especially when we get to 2025 and the next president of the United States takes the oath of office, we will commence the golden age of American conservatism.
Oh, I like the sound of that. But to do that, we kind of have to hang together, to borrow a phrase from another founder, Ben Franklin. And, you know, I remember hearing for the last several decades that the Republican Party needs to be a big tent Republican, or getting it out of the party discussion. The conservative movement needs to be a big tent conservatism. I agree with that. Rick Grinnell and I have a lot in common. Senator Tim Scott and I have a lot in common. Philosophically, that's the big tent. There seems to be a difference of opinion now about the big tent. You mentioned never-Trumpers. It's like if you don't fit in their tent, you're not allowed. We're kind of fractious that way right now.
Well, they are, and I think the difficulty is that many in that camp are intellectually dishonest. And I don't say that lightly, as you know. All they need to say is, we hate Donald Trump and we don't want to be part of any movement that he's part of. But they don't say that. They shroud that in pseudo-intellectual things that have nothing to do with conservatives wielding power when they're actually in office. They don't even like Ron DeSantis, who I think happens to personify a conservative governor wielding power.
Well, this has become this thing. It's not just Trump. It's not just opposing Trump or disagreeing with Trump. You must disavow Trump. Otherwise, you're not allowed in the conversation, and that's quite a litmus test.
Well, it is, and
why disavow a man, by the way, who brought us the three Supreme Court justices that finally got rid of Roe v. Wade, something I thought we all wanted for the last 5 decades.
It's all curious, but in the spirit of Heritage, which for 50 years has been focused on adding and multiplying the conservative movement, we'll talk to anybody. We try to get along with everyone. We have differences of opinion with other organizations that are to our left, but still right of center, because we're a pretty conservative organization, as you know. We will work with anyone on those issues we agree for the purpose of restoring self-governance to the American people. I think as a movement, if we can remain focused on that, then a lot of these somewhat legitimate debates and some of the illegitimate ones coming from the never-Trumpers, I think will begin to dissipate for this reason. We have 2 elections, I think, to turn this country around. And at Heritage, we know what time it is, and the time that it is the time to fight, not with ourselves and the conservative movement, but to fight the radical leftists who every day want to undermine our freedoms.
You do know what time it is. I like hearing that. And again, I keep saying it's not your grandfather's Heritage Foundation. Although I jokingly said a couple of weeks ago that Heritage Foundation has this image of bald men smoking cigars. And I mean,
do you
smoke cigars?
I do.
There we go. Dr. Kevin Roberts, Heritage Foundation. Keep it here. More to come on O'Connor Tonight.